Hey y'all, it's Stephen Van Kampen-Lewis, and today I'm here with Nick Rust of Rusty Exotics, and we are going to be chatting about Habenarias actually, which is something I haven't discussed on my channel, but I think is a really cool genus with a lot of breeding potential, and seems to be getting more popular. And it's sort of an underappreciated genus, and I've brought Nick here to chat about this genus and why it should be grown, how he grows it, and chat a little bit about his really intense article in Orchids magazine, the AOS magazine, in 2024. And anyway, I'm talking too much. Nick, tell us a little bit about yourself and orchids in general, and then how you started growing Habenaria.
Sure. Yeah. So, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, my name's Nick Rust. My background is mostly in biochemistry, all human, ironically enough, which I get asked a lot because, I do my own breeding, all that own stuff, but I don't actually have a background in plants. So, all human stuff. I got into growing orchids I was in high school. I believe it was my sophomore year in high school. And I very quickly got interested in breeding them and kind of figured out sort of how to do it. I failed for maybe 2 or 3 years because I really didn't understand the ins and outs of the science behind it yet. But where that started. And in terms of Habenaria, I was just thinking about this morning because when I first saw Habenaria, I kind of just shrugged them off. I was like, they're neat, but they're not really my thing. And so I got a Hab dentata and a Hab medusa, some of the larger, kind of more exciting white species and fringy species. And I kind of pushed all these rhodokyla types, the ones with the brighter colors, aside. And then one day I saw, I don't remember who it was, but someone had this just huge, very well grown, bright orange Habrotochyla. And I mean, it was just like that. I got pulled into it, and that's kind of been my main thing ever since.
And it's funny that you mentioned that because I up until recently was similarly sort of not necessarily unimpressed with Habanero, but I was like, well, whatever, they're cool looking. But
Yep.
and then I was at Redland judging maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I saw just this not a full bench of Habenaria, but it was probably really the first ones that I saw in real life. And like you said, the colors, they're so intense and they're just
Oh,
so
yeah.
saturated in those flowers. And the photos, even the best photos, just don't seem to capture that sort of
Yep.
depth of color that your eyes pick up. And I was just blown away. And I was like, how have I been growing for over 30 years and never really gotten into this genus? Like it's really it's a cool, like I said, underappreciated genus. Um and so here we are chatting about it. I'm thinking about I'll probably grab some here in the next couple of years, and I'd really appreciate it if you could tell me sort of about Habenaria. Where are they geographically? And it seems, based on your article, that there's a ton of them, and that
Oh, yeah.
they're kind of everywhere. So let's chat about a little bit about that.
Yeah, so yeah, you're right. They kind of are everywhere. The vast majority, I'd say 98% of what's in cultivation though, all come from Southeast and Southern Asia.
Okay.
So India, Laos, Malaysia, all Southeast Asian countries. However, we've got Habenaria in the southeastern US. There are tons of species from South America, and these are incredible species too. They're large, they've got huge white fringy flowers. I mean, they're incredible. I believe there's a ton of um, kind of potential for hybridization and especially just growing with those species. There are some African species that are just otherworldly.
Hmm.
There are even like 18 to maybe 21 species in Australia. So, I mean, they are all over the world. Um, yeah.
So it kind of sounds like I mean, bulbophyllum, I feel like, we've grown them in the US for a while. And then, Bill Toms, of course, was the sort of bulbo guru. And then his collection went to Kroll Smith, and Kroll Smith has just been going gangbusters with with the new breeding and the new species that we don't get to
Oh
see.
yeah,
But still,
love
there's
the
so
breeding.
many. Yeah, it's just like the tip of the iceberg, and it kind of seems like Habenaria might be sort of the next bulbophyllum or even dendrobium, where there's so much that we're just not getting cultivation here, and there's so much cool variety in the different species.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Because I had mentioned before, almost everything we grow is from Southeast Asia. Well, to put that in even more of an extreme, there's just over 900 species of Habenaria,
Wow.
and we only use between 10 and 15 of them commonly in all of the hybrids that have been made today. Only about 10 to 15 species.
So
So, I
like
mean, there's just
1%, 1 to 2%.
yeah. So there's just an enormous pool of all these other species that haven't even been touched by, I mean, by no one yet. And especially in the past maybe 4 or 5 years, we finally, mostly Leon Glissenstein and I have been really trying to use some of these lesser used species and have been getting just some really off the wall cool hybrids from
Hmm.
it.
That's really cool. And are they all terrestrial or are they mostly terrestrial or?
That's a very good question. They're mostly terrestrial, but there are some strict epiphytes, like
Hmm,
there's a hab from India called what's it called? It's Habenaria sandigoensis. That is, it's a true epiphyte.
interesting. So it's kind of like the pseudopodiums. I mean,
Mhm.
I think most Americans think of pseudopodiums as epiphytes because they're familiar with punctatum in Florida, but really most of them are terrestrial, and there's a few that are epiphytes. So
Yeah,
yeah. And as far as the Habenaria sort of, I mean, it's I almost said pan-tropical, but it's even wider than that because it's in North America, so it's not even just strictly tropical. But do they tend to inhabit a particular niche, ecological niche, or are they just
they
sort of
do.
okay? They do.
Yeah, they absolutely do. So the one thing that pretty much all species have in common, except the epiphytic ones, is they like kind of wet, boggier areas. So more wetland areas.
Okay,
Doesn't matter if you go to Australia, South America, but even the ones in the US, they all grow in more damp areas.
interesting.
So there are some strict bog ones. Most of the US ones are strict bog orchids. You head over to Southeast Asia, almost all of them grow in floodplains or in areas that are right next to streams. So you'll actually see images of them growing like on rocks, on these very mossy, kind of soil covered rocks right next to a stream. And so during part of the year, when it's raining a bunch during the monsoon season in Asia, they'll get submerged. They'll be
Wow.
soaking wet the whole time. And then when it gets dry, they go dormant. So yeah, that's the kind of habitat that pretty much all of them grow in.
And so I guess that's a good segue into the cultural aspects. And I know that it's highly deciduous. As a group, they're highly deciduous, especially the
Oh
ones that
yeah.
are growing. Um, my experience with catasetums, that sort of dormant period is this sort of mystical, magical thing to so many people. Is it as tricky with Habenaria, less tricky, or how does that work?
I'm glad you brought up catasetum because when people ask about dormancy, I always equate it to catasetum because
Mm,
catasetum and habenaria, their dormancies, in terms of how you treat the plant, is almost identical.
mm,
The only thing is catasetum, you have the roots to kind of give you an idea of when you should start watering again.
mhm.
You don't really have that cue for Habenaria because everything happens under the soil. So the only thing you have is the foliage. Um, but yeah, I'd say it's very, very similar to Catasetum. So, Catasetum, when they're dormant, sometimes they need water. If you see that pseudobulb shriveling, Habenaria are the same way. If you actually go and you check the tuber and you notice it's really soft and a little squishy,
Hmm,
give it a quick spray with water. It'll firm back up in about 24 hours. It's going to be good to go. But
interesting.
what I always say to look at, because you don't have the roots that you would in Catasetum, is once the plant starts growing, you can pot it about maybe half an inch to an inch below the soil. Wait for 3 leaves to grow. So you want that rosette to fully unfurrow, And then once you have that full rosette, the three leaves, at that point, that plant's roots are going to start growing more. And it's going to start searching for water. If you don't give it water, it's going to be an unhappy plant. So three leaves, full rosette, that's when you start watering Habenaria. And then,
So, oh, go ahead.
oh, how I keep them during that time is just like this. So I put them in a plastic bag with just a little bit of dry medium. These tubers are going to slowly give off moisture throughout the winter. And by putting them in a plastic bag, it's going to hold on to that moisture that prevents them from desiccating or drying out, but it never gets high enough that it's going to cause them to rot. So this is like the try and true way to keep Habenaria through dormancy, in my opinion.
So, so if we walk through this whole year long process, let's say we buy a tuber from someone like yourself or wherever, and so we get it in this bag. So we're waiting in spring for a little new growth, and then we pot it up. Is that right?
Correct, yeah. And it usually starts growing between February and March. I'd say mid-February to mid-March on average is when they start growing.
And this is across all the species that you can typically find in the United States.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And then so you're waiting. So it kind of pops up, it breaks the surface, it's in the soil, you pot it up, it breaks the surface, then you wait for the three leaves. So a lot of catasetum growers
Really.
say, all right, those roots are 3 or 4 inches long. We're looking
Yep.
for leaves this time, also a multiple of three. And then so they're well differentiated, like they're this big or a little smaller or
So at that point, it's going to depend on what you're looking at. And so
mm,
this is why I always say three leaves or the full rosette, because some have Medusa hybrids, they might be 4, 5, 6 inches tall. But a Habrotichyla might be an inch tall.
oh
So
wow.
depending
Okay.
on what you're looking at, it could be very, very different in terms of size. But as long as it's got those three leaves, it's good to start watering.
And if you hold off too long, you can kind of mess it up because it's in desperate need of water and nutrients, and you don't get it at the right time. It's just, is that it? Lights out?
Yeah, yeah. So one interesting thing that I actually noticed about Habenaria, because when I was making my talk on Habenaria, um, to get good pictures of plants through dormancy, I basically had a sacrificial plant
Oh,
where I just kept digging it up, taking pictures, repotting it, digging it up, taking pictures, repotting it. And something interesting that I noticed by doing that is when you have the rosette, the roots are maybe about half a centimeter long,
oh
maybe a
wow.
centimeter. So what is that? Like 0.3 inches? I don't I
Small,
can't.
real small.
Yeah, tiny. And as long as I kept it dry and didn't water it, those roots didn't do anything.
Hmm.
But once I finally started watering it, that's what kind of induced the roots to start growing.
Oh,
So once they make that rosette and they make those little root nubbins, those roots just sit there and they're waiting. They're saying, okay, where's the water? Where's the water? And then once you finally give them that water, that's going to induce them to start growing.
okay.
So that's why if you water them too early, it can be really bad and you can rot the plant because those root nubbins, they're not mature enough. If you water them too late, then you risk those root nubbins actually dying because they
Mhm.
get too dry. They've just been sitting there waiting too long. And then they go, all right, we tried. We're gonna die out now. We've used all the water in the tuber. It can't work anymore.
And so when you're ready to water, like, are you dumping it on, or is it kind of a slow process? And I'm just, I think it's official. I'm going to keep going back to the catasetum comparison.
Hmm.
Um, but with catasetums, some people say you should do it slowly. I hit them with the hose right off the bat, and that's it.
I do too. I do too.
So for Habanarias, does it matter?
Yeah, I hit them with the hose as soon as they get to that point too.
Okay.
And then at that point, all the way until those leaves start yellowing when they get dormant or when they get ready for dormancy again, I'll try to keep them well watered the whole time.
Okay.
Mhm.
And so during that growth period, that sort of summertime, late spring, summer, when the leaves are extending, you said they like it pretty wet. Are they drying? Are they approaching dryness? Or are they staying fairly wet this whole time?
Mine approach dryness. I never let them quite get dry. So
Hmm.
Habenaria, when they're growing, if you let them get too dry, the leaf tips will get all sorts of different weird markings. You'll get yellowing, you'll get this really kind of, it looks like a bacterial spotting or a fungal spotting, but it's not, but it's these brown kind of irregular looking spots that form at the tips of the leaves. They just get very ugly if you keep them too dry. And it won't necessarily kill the plants, but if they're dry for a week, you water it again, dry for a week, you're gonna kind of have a pretty ugly looking plant.
Yeah, yeah. And as far as like temperature, fertilizer, and sunlight during this growth period goes, what are the preferred conditions and what are the conditions that they're willing to accept on both the hot and the cold side?
So temperature, they are warm to hot growing for the most part. All these Southeast Asian ones. I'd say the minimum I'd give them is maybe 65 Fahrenheit, but they can take all the way into the hundreds Fahrenheit, no problem, as long as you keep them well watered.
Mm,
And I want to actually go back to dormancy because I get this question a lot too, is during dormancy, you also want to keep them warm. So keep them at least above 55. There's kind of this assumption with some people that if something's dormant, that means it's you want it to be cold or
mm,
cool. No, no, they need a warm but dry dormancy. In terms of lighting, the smaller growing species, so like your Rhodokyla type, a bunch of the ones that have those really bright kind of neon colored flowers, they're going to be about medium light, so between Phalaenopsis and Cattleya.
okay,
The larger growing plants, so the white flowered and fringed ones like Dentata, Medusa, Pictylus Susannae, just some of the larger growing plants, they like bright light. So just below or equal to Cattleya lighting is good for them.
interesting. That's good to know. And I assume like most deciduous plants are probably pretty heavy feeders. They like a lot of fertilizer.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna get to. Yeah, they like their fertilizer. So I use Osmocote or Nutricote. I use Nutricote. I used to use Osmocote. I'll put just a few granules on there, maybe like an eighth of a teaspoon of granules at the beginning of the growth season, and then 6 months in, I'll put another eighth of a teaspoon. But then liquid fertilizer, I use I should go every 2 to 3 weeks, but it really ends up being every 4 to 5 weeks.
Okay. And then okay, that's. I mean that's a lot of fertilizer. That's sort of
Mhm.
catechedum level fertilizer.
Oh yeah, easily.
Okay.
And the fun part though is they have they've got the pots, the tubers, they don't have pseudobulbs, so what they grow as the storage unit instead of the pseudobulb is a tuber which is under the soil. And so as you're feeding them and as they're growing these new tubers, I wish I had a pot here, but sometimes you'll see that pot just start to deform as you get these huge
Oh
new
wow.
tubers growing under the soil. So
Cool.
that means you're doing something right and they're using that fertilizer.
And they're storing away for winter. And then
Oh
now
yeah.
before we get to winter, of course, we have the fall as they're starting to go dormant after a great summer. They've I'm looking outside of my window here. They've for my plants they'll be outside in the Texas sun with a shade cloth over top. So they've endured that. They've done well. They're blooming now and then going dormant, or how does
Correct.
that work?
Yeah. Yeah, so they are mostly mid to late fall, early winter bloomers. So it's not odd to get blooms, in all the way into November, sometimes early December. I think my birthday, which is mid-October, is really their peak blooming season.
Okay.
Um, Once they start blooming, you can kind of get a little bit more lax on water. So you can let them dry out for maybe 3 to 5 days and they're going to be okay. And then once those blooms fade, all the leaves are going to start yellowing.
Hmm.
They're just going to look really kind of unhappy. And then the yellowing is going to pretty rapidly spread throughout the entire plant. And so as soon as you see those tips yellow, cut watering.
Totally.
Completely cut it.
Completely. Okay.
Completely. Because they
Are
go dormant very quickly.
Interesting. Are you scaling back the fertilizer around blooming time, or is it just kind of business as usual? Or
So personally, I will continue fertilizing all the way up until the blooms start fading. And the
Hmm.
reason that I do that is because I'm making all these crosses, so a bunch of plants are producing a bunch of seed pods. So I want to make sure that they they keep getting the nutrients they need, not just to make the tubers, but also to make a whole bunch of nice seed.
Okay.
So yeah, I wouldn't change fertilizing at all until the blooms fade.
Interesting. So it's a much more abrupt process starting really and finishing. They're expecting the water to just turn on and then they're expecting the water to just turn off.
Yeah, it's pretty drastic. But you
Cool.
got to think that where these are growing, like I said, it's kind of floodplain type habitats or these seasonal streams. So for part of the year, they're getting tons and tons and tons of water almost constantly. And then once it starts drying out, that stream is still going to persist for a while. But then once that water is gone, any water in the soil is going to evaporate. And then just like that, there's nothing.
Yeah.
It's not raining. They don't have that reservoir of the stream or the floodplain they're in. There's just no water anymore. And
Huh.
so they're expecting a relatively quick cutoff. So these plants, as soon as the water's gone, they're like, all right, we're good. See you in 3 months, and they're done.
That kind of it sounds like it kind of makes it easier than catasetums, which have this sort of gradual up and down, and then or these guys, it's very binary. You're wet or you're not. You're awake or you're asleep, and that's it. That sounds
Yep.
cool.
Yeah. It makes it very easy. Yeah. At least in my opinion.
And so what are the most common ways that people kill them, and how do you remedy that? Is that during dormancy, during growth, or what?
I think the most common way that people kill them is giving them too much water during dormancy. Because
Okay.
if you're not used to deciduous plants, the idea of, oh yeah, that plant, you're basically going to pretend it doesn't exist for the next 90 days can be difficult. And so I would say, yeah, too much water during dormancy is probably the number one killer. That's why I'm really a fan of the bag method
Hmm.
because you've got those tubers right there. You can monitor them. You can look at them, say, oh, yeah, they're firm. They're perfectly happy and healthy. Or you can go, oh, actually, they are a little bit squishy. So I'll just give it a small mist. You know, you usually don't need to using this method, but sometimes you do. Um, and then that way you're not wondering, oh, am I overwatering it? Is the tuber okay? That's why I like that method. I think the second most common way of killing them is actually going right into dormancy.
Hmm.
So this is the other thing I hear all the time, and I'm sure you probably hear it too with catasetum. Oh, my plant, the leaves are yellowing. It must be dying. So
Yeah.
I'm just going to give it more and more and more water. Like, no, that's that's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and especially how drastically quick the yellowing is with Habenaria. Sometimes, you can understand why people would look at it and go, "Oh my gosh, my plant's dying. I gotta just douse it in water." When in reality, you want to do the opposite.
Yeah.
Really want to let it go dry. So I'd say
And
that's the number one killer for Habenaria.
and so to remedy that, let's say you've got your plants and your tubers in the bag with a little bit of soil there and the name tag. I noticed that I couldn't see any water droplets inside of your bag that you showed. Is that
Correct.
sort of a good indication that you're looking for?
Yeah, if you ever see water droplets, it means one of two things, and then that is A, that the soil you put in was probably a little bit too damp. You
Mhm.
don't want that. Or B, that you actually might have way too many tubers in a single bag. And this is a problem that I kind of ran into last year. I always use these little sandwich bags. And because I do my own flasking, if I have a some unbloomed, unnamed hybrid, I'll put everything into a single bag. Well, last year I had some bags that, I mean, they were filled to the very top with tubers.
Hmm.
And I noticed that I was starting to see condensation on the inside because all of these tubers were just releasing a little bit of moisture.
Yeah.
Then I started to see rot. So it was not good. So all you want it to be, just a few tubers at the bottom, maybe a fourth of the bag filled, and that's okay. So if you see condensation, it probably means they're staying a little bit too damp inside of that bag.
And you just unseal it for a little bit, let it kind of
Yep,
air out a little bit, and then you seal it back up, and you're probably good.
exactly. Yeah, that is exactly what I'll do.
Huh,
hmm
very cool. Um, and so what are the, I mean, we talked about how there's only a handful that are being grown. what are the groups that are being grown, and why do you think we're only focused on those groups and not others?
I think the most common that are being grown right now are Habemedusa, especially Habenaria Medusa, just because if you have a picture of it, as soon as people see that, everybody wants it. It's incredible. It's a large plant. It's alien-esque. Some of its hybrids are a little more popular too. And then the second most common is the kind of section Rhodokyla. And I'd say the majority of the ones that are being grown of those are actually no ID hybrids, but
Hmm.
all of them just end up being sold as Rhodokyla.
And for everybody out there listening who's not familiar, the Rhodokyla group, I mean, they're sort of the pastel colors, right? There's whites, pinks, yellows, orange, and then neon red as well, right?
Correct, yes.
And then so and you say it's a complex, is it taxonomically without making everybody glaze over? Is it sort of in flux, or is it like
It's
is it changing? Is it going to change or what?
I think it's going to change. It's a very, very in-depth question, but I think it's going to change. I legitimately think that Q is waiting for someone to actually make a Q, for anybody who doesn't know, Q and the RHS kind of oversee orchid taxonomy. And so they're the ones who say, yes, we accept this species, we don't accept this species, etc. I think they're waiting on someone to sit down and really define the different characteristics of each of these species and then get it published in a peer-reviewed journal. Because
Hmm,
then you can say, yes, we accept the species, and here is the study that actually looked at it that we can reference to say why we accept them as species. So I
okay.
think that'll happen one day. I don't know when it'll happen. Um, but to try and simply answer the question of this kind of ebb and flow of the complex, there are four main species. There's Rhodokyla, Roebelii, Xanthokyla, and Eric Michaeli. Eric Michaeli is pink, Roebelii is red, Xanthokyla is yellow, Rhodokyla is orange. But then what makes it more complex is there are flava forms of Rhodokyla,
Hmm,
there are red forms of Rhodokyla. There are orange forms of Roebelii. There's an albescent white form of Roebelii. So you have all of these different colors that if you don't know what you're looking at, it can make it really confusing to say what is what. And so I think that's where a lot of that confusion kind of occurs when other people who might not know the species as well start hybridizing and then selling these plants as just Rhodokyla.
and I would imagine if you have them all next to each other, and let's say they're pure, maybe they're somewhat you can tell the difference. But then if you're not familiar with all four of them and you got one in front of you, or maybe it's like you said, a no ID hybrid that somebody crossed, um, maybe even decades ago, it's got to be really tricky. How do you tell them apart, and who's growing the right ones that are labeled correctly?
Great question. Yeah, so telling the species apart is very easy if you know what you're looking for. You can tell instantly if you have an up close of the flower
Hmm.
because the shape of the flowers, the organization of the reproductive structures, they're all different. The sizes are different. Or even if you have plants that are not in bloom, you can tell the species because the tuber shape is different, the growth habit's different, the height of the plant or the size of the plant is different. So if you have them together, it's very easy to go, oh, I see. That's why they've called this a different species. But once again, if you just look at it and you say, oh, that one's yellow and this one is pink, I'll cross them together and they both look like what I think is Rhodokyla. It makes sense why people might get a little confused.
Yeah, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
And then who is selling the correct IDs? There are two vendors who come to mind immediately if you want to talk about that now.
Yeah, for sure.
Sure. So Edgar from Windswept in Time, he's pretty good with Habenaria. He usually has some for sale each year, and I know he's doing some of his own breeding. Um, I'm not really sure what his focus is, but I do know he's doing some really good work.
Mm.
And then Sarah Hurdle is another just fantastic grower. She's an AOS judge. I believe she just started doing some breeding herself, and she sells some plants too. Oh, what is
Is she need more?
That's it. Yeah, need more. Yeah,
Need more
need.
orchids.
Yep.
Okay. And need more is
And
one word, I think. She
yes.
squeezed. Yeah.
Yep, that's
Okay.
right. So
I am
both of
on her
them
list.
have, yeah,
Yeah.
they've got some great plants and they're always going to be labeled correctly too.
And then yourself as well, right?
Okay.
You
Yeah.
sell too, right?
Yeah, I sell a bunch. Yeah. Yeah.
And you're able to tell them apart, and you're able to sort of figure out which is which, and you're doing your own breeding too, also, right?
Yeah. And in terms of the Rhodochyla complex, I actually wrote an article a few years back that has sort of been circulated around here and there, just talking about some of the differences. But I really need to update it at some point. But yeah,
And is that on your website, or is that in one of the magazines, or?
actually not. So it's circulated around some local societies. So like
Hmm,
the Atlanta Orchid Society had it, and then a few others that are slipping my mind asked for it at one point. I should put it on my website though. That would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it?
yeah, yeah, for sure. And then so the really extensive article that you wrote on AOS in 2024, does that cover a lot of the same material? Would that be considered a pretty good update?
It'd be so that article really focused more on just species in general and
Hmm,
then a little bit of hybridization, but I don't touch on differentiating the Rhodochyla complex in that one.
gotcha.
The reason that I didn't do that, I mentioned that there's a difference between these plants, but getting into all the differences, it requires all sorts of photographs, it requires all sorts of explanations, and I didn't want to add what would probably be at least another 3 or 4 pages onto that article just to explain that.
The editors were like, hold on, dude. We can only do
Yeah.
some.
Well, there's kind of a funny backstory on how that article actually kind of came into fruition when, the AOS, they reached out to me and they said, "Hey, we'd like this article. Will you write it for us?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And at first it was supposed to be just a very short article. And so I sent them the initial draft and they came back and they said, "Hey, could you actually do a full length one for us? So just take this and add more stuff." And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And so it just sort of happened that way.
That's cool. And for anyone who's watching this and is getting interested in Habenaria, I definitely recommend checking that article out. The photographs are great. The narrative is amazing. It's a really good comprehensive sort of broad overview of the whole group. And you talk about the Rockhyla group, but as well as some of the other ones, and maybe some of those other ones that we can hopefully start seeing here in the United States more
Hmm.
and more often.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I believe I have a picture of Hab astrosinensis in that. And that's one of those really kind of funky Southeast Asian species that I started using in hybridization a few years back. And I think after the article came out, I finally started seeing some first blooms from hybrids using that species that are just super, super cool. But yeah, no, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you'll have to do a follow-up here with the updates of breeding and some of the other species that you get to play with over the next couple of years.
Oh yeah, I'd love to do just kind of a deep dive into hybrids with Habenaria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Nick, I appreciate it. This is a great overview of the group and sort of talking about why it's cool, why people need to grow it more, and why people can come to you or some of these other vendors that you mentioned for some of these Habanarios. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my main list is going to come out about April. Um, we're going to have some really neat ones on there this year. I'll tell you that. We have some very unique hybrids on the 2025 list.
And that's rustyexotics.com, correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, I want to make sure that everybody's like, hey, they know where to go to find you.
Yeah, I don't think I mentioned the name.
Yeah.
That's important.
Cool. Well, appreciate it, and we'll have to do this again.
Oh yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I've been watching your YouTube videos for years at this point. So
Uh,
I'm very excited to finally be here.
yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm glad they're helpful, and I'll get to meet you when you come through Texas here later this year. Yeah, I'll definitely get to see you and hang out.
Yeah, all right, sounds good.
All right, see ya.
All right. Well, it was great talking to you.